A lot is happening in Palestine right now, particularly in Jerusalem and Gaza. Here are 3 things you should know about it. Number 1, this is ethnic cleansing, not a real estate dispute. As the recent major Human Rights Watch report shows, the status quo for all Palestinians living under Israeli rule is apartheid. Now, Israel imposes different forms of apartheid on different Palestinians, but for all of them, Israel engages in systemic, institutionalized discrimination and a crushing denial of their most basic rights. That started with the establishment of Israel, when it drove out more than 750,000 Palestinians out of their homes and destroyed more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages in order to create a Jewish majority in a place that had a Palestinian Arab majority. And what's happening today is a continuation of that process. In the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, the Israeli government is pushing to expel Palestinians out of their homes in order to give those homes to Israeli settlers. And this isn't the first time that this is happening.
It's becoming a familiar scene in East Jerusalem. Jewish settlers taking over a Palestinian home and dumping the furniture in the garden.
This is the settlers' strategy. House by house, family by family, they're trying to take over the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. They're doing so with the full cooperation of the Israeli police and the Israeli courts. And it's a pattern that's repeating all over East Jerusalem.
And to make matters worse, these families in Sheikh Jarrah were already refugees driven out from their homes when Israel was established. Now, while some Israeli leaders are upfront about this being an effort to drive out Palestinians to achieve demographic dominance in Jerusalem, others try to hide their real aim and pretend that this is all a real estate dispute that the Israeli courts can handle. But let's not forget that this is all happening in East Jerusalem, which is occupied Palestinian territory that Israel has no legal claim to whatsoever. A mountain of UN resolutions makes that much clear. Expelling an occupied people out of their homes in order to transfer the occupiers' population into those homes is a war crime under international law. Number 2, racism and brutality are on full display. The violence in Jerusalem did not come out of nowhere. It's been slowly brewing on the back of rising bigotry and incitement by Israeli leaders. In fact, the head of the so-called Jewish Power Party, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the guy who says that the Israeli terrorist who massacred 29 Palestinians in a mosque is his hero, is now sitting in the Israeli Knesset and is allies with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the same guy seen here standing next to the deputy mayor of Jerusalem as he taunted an injured Palestinian demonstrator and saying that he wished he had been shot in the head. This incident came just days after mobs of Jewish supremacists in the hundreds took the streets of Jerusalem chanting death to Arabs and assaulting scores of random innocent Palestinians. With Palestinian demonstrators drawing attention to the impending ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needed a distraction, and the surest way to get one is to keep escalating violence against Palestinians until he could provoke a violent response so he could switch up the narrative. So it was no surprise that Israeli occupation forces drastically escalated their violence, brutalizing unarmed Palestinian demonstrators and invading their holiest places of worship, with scenes of Israeli mobs chanting genocidal slogans as flames from Israel's assault on the Al-Aqsa compound burned in the background. Now, just imagine if the situation were reversed. If it was armed Palestinians invading Jewish places of worship and brutalizing unarmed Israelis in videos that littered social media, that footage would be playing on a loop as breaking news on just about every network. Unfortunately, many did not pay attention until what happened next. Number 3, Israel is massacring civilians in Gaza. In the face of sustained racist brutality towards Palestinians and attacks on their holiest sites, militants in Gaza fired rockets at Israel, and now a lot of people are referring to Israel's bombing of Gaza as a response. But there are 2 things to keep in mind here. The first is that Israel is inherently the initiator of violence simply by being an occupying power present by force on Palestinian land, imposing apartheid on an occupied people. And this includes Gaza, where Palestinians are under siege and occupation, trapped with no access to the outside world. Israel claiming self-defense in this situation is every bit as absurd as an armed and violent intruder in your home claiming to be defending themselves. And then Israel is yet again responsible for escalating the violence by expanding its ethnic cleansing and assaulting demonstrators in places of worship. So if you're thinking about referring to a cycle of violence, just remember this key context. This is violence between an oppressor imposing occupation and apartheid and the victims of that oppression and apartheid. Only one side here, Israel, holds all of the power, has all of the fighter jets, controls all of the borders, and is imposing systemic oppression on an entire people. To speak of this as if there are two equal sides is to distort the most basic reality. The second thing is that Israel regularly bombs civilian areas in Gaza indiscriminately, to the condemnation of every major human rights organization in the world. Back in 2014, they killed more than 500 Palestinian children in the span of 6 weeks. And in just the last few days, they've killed no less than 27 Palestinian children and brought down entire apartment buildings. These are also war crimes, and they are the end result of Israel's refusal to see Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same dignity and rights that Israelis have. And now, after endless incitement, a horror show is unfolding throughout Israel, where mobs are breaking into random Palestinian homes and attacking the residents while children scream. Destroying random Palestinian businesses and interrogating random drivers on the streets to let cars with Jewish drivers or passengers go unharmed while attacking Palestinian cars. And the worst of it all is that Israel's violence is paid for with our tax dollars, to the tune of $3.8 billion every year. That's more than $430,000 every hour of our money going to finance these crimes. So for anyone who's interested in solving the crisis in Palestine, or just in making sure that their money is not funding war crimes, there's a very simple question to ask. Is this how our money should be spent?